And let's get more on that now with the number 2 Democrat in the Senate, Dick Durbin of Illinois, and from Ohio, Republican Senator Rob Portman, a member of the committee crafting that budget deal. Senator Portman, let me begin with you. You serve on that committee. Is a deal going to get done this week, and can you guarantee no government shutdown?
George, I certainly hope so, and I think there's an obvious solution here. It was just alluded to, which is the fact that we can shift some of the savings from the part of the budget that Congress appropriates every year to the part of the budget, the 2/3 of the budget that is called mandatory spending, keep the budget caps in place, not raise taxes, which is important during this weak economy, and actually avoid a government shutdown. So I'm hopeful that even by the end of this week, we'll be able to come together and achieve that.
One of the sticking points is going to be, of course, that extension of unemployment benefits for the long-term unemployed. Senator Durbin, the House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi, saying there's no deal without having those benefits extended. Are Democrats united on that? No extension, no deal?
No, I don't think we've reached that point where we've said this is it, take it or leave it. What I hear from Patty Murray, I spoke to her the other night, negotiations are making progress, moving in the right direction. They haven't closed the deal, but I certainly hope as part of it that the negotiators will take to heart what the president had to say. There are working families across America that are struggling. There are unemployed families who need a helping hand. We've got to protect and preserve the safety net in America and give these working families a fighting chance.
Senator Portman, can the Republicans live with that? Can you get an extension if it's paid for?
Yeah, it's about $25 billion that no one was talking about, George, until the last week. So it's an additional cost within this budget agreement. I think the thought always was that would be handled separately. So I'm glad to hear my colleague Dick Durbin say that that's not necessarily a sticking point in this, because I think there are different ways to look at it. But look, the key is that we not have another government shutdown, that we do keep the spending caps in place, that we don't raise taxes at a time when the economy is still weak. And I think we can accomplish that over the next couple of days.
Gentlemen, I have to say, it sounds like the spirit of Nelson Mandela is taking hold. This is a very reasonable discussion this morning. Sounds like we're going to reach a deal this week. Let me turn on to something that might be a little bit more contentious, and that is this fight over the whether or not to raise the minimum wage. We saw those protests this week in more than 100 American cities calling for a living wage. And Senator Durbin, let me begin with you. We know that there's deep divisions on this in the Congress right now. If it's unlikely that you're going to see a major increase in the minimum wage right now in this Congress, should companies like McDonald's, headquartered in your own state, do more on their own?
Yes, and I'll tell you, George, you can remember, because you were on Capitol Hill, there was a time when raising the minimum wage was a bipartisan issue, and we did it regularly to protect those hardworking Americans who couldn't keep up with the expenses of life. Now it's become a partisan issue. The same can be said when it comes to food stamps. Think about all the people working now with wages so low that they qualify for a helping hand to put food on the table. That was the #1 thing on the agenda of House Republicans to cut dramatically. We've got to have a bipartisan consensus that people that go to work every day and want to go to work every day get a helping hand so that they don't have to live paycheck to paycheck.
What about that, Senator Portman? You can't raise a family on the minimum wage, that's for sure. You can't even get above the poverty line for a family of 2. Why not raise it?
Well, because of the concern about jobs. Dick's right. In the past, some of us have voted to raise the minimum wage, and I think Republicans as a whole agree there ought to be a minimum wage and it ought to be fair. But we're very concerned about jobs. That's the key right now. How do you get people to work? If you want to deal with income inequality, the #1 way to do it is to get people to work. That's what all the statistics show. About 2% of Americans get paid the minimum wage. Of that group, by the way, less than 0.3% of Americans are both under the line of poverty and on minimum wage. So it's a lot of young people. About 50% of them are between 16 and 24 years old. For a lot of them, it's a part-time job. So what you don't want to do is raise the minimum wage to the point that you're actually losing jobs. By the way, a lot of people have expressed this concern who might surprise you. Christina Romer, former head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama, has raised this concern. I went to a burger place this past week, George, and there was a digital display to be able to buy a hamburger, and there was nobody behind the counter except the cashier. And you go into these fast food places now, often there's a drink dispenser, so you have one fewer person. So that's the concern. If you raise the minimum wage too high, you're going to have not more jobs, but fewer jobs and fewer opportunities, particularly for these young people, because, again, about half the people who get the minimum wage are between 16 and 24. So I think Republicans are going to look at this through the context of how do you get this economy moving, how do you increase the jobs? And despite what you said earlier about the jobs numbers last month, the job picture is still terrible.
The long-term unemployment certainly is.
People are leaving the workforce.
Senator Durbin, what about those arguments we just heard from Senator Portman? You know, some of those protests this week calling for a $15 an hour living wage. Even if you don't believe there's a significant economic impact at a lower number, at $15 an hour, that likely is going to cost jobs.
George, let me remind you that when you go back to the beginning of the law creating a minimum wage in America under President Franklin Roosevelt 80 years ago, exactly the same argument that my colleague from Ohio just made was made against it. Every time we've tried to raise the standard of living for hardworking people at the low end of the income scale, they've said, oh my goodness, you're just going to kill off jobs. The facts and statistics do not back it up. Here's what we've got to really accept. It isn't just the minimum wage. It's making sure through the Affordable Care Act that working Americans have access to affordable health insurance, which the other party, I'm afraid, is totally opposed to, and they should be for. It's the Earned Income Tax Credit that was created under President Ronald Reagan, a Republican. We've got to make sure that that keeps up with the needs of working Americans. This used to be a bipartisan consensus. We've got to get back to that day, or the working folks across America are going to fall further and further behind.
Well, it seems like we might get a bipartisan consensus this week on a short-term budget deal, but on some of these deeper issues, a lot of debate. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this morning. Senators, thank you both.